Someone had to pay for this disaster. And those words hit me like a freight train as I sat across from my manager's desk, watching him flip through termination letters from our three biggest accounts, his eyes never lifting from the papers as if they held the secrets of the universe, before calmly adding that someone was me. And in that moment, everything inside me collapsed. 3 years, 3 full years of pouring my soul into these clients, knowing their kids' names, their favorite coffee orders, exactly how they wanted their quarterly reports formatted, taking midnight calls when systems crashed, working through my own birthday to meet deadlines, learning their businesses better than some of their own employees. Yet Jerome waved me off like an annoying fly and said they'd specifically mentioned dissatisfaction with their account management, that it was my mess, and that he was tired of cleaning up my mistakes, my throat turning to sandpaper as I realized the worst part wasn't the accusation, but how easily he said it, like firing me was just another task on his calendar. Hey everyone, I'm Delilah. I'm 28, and I used to believe hard work and loyalty actually meant something, so before I tell you what happened next, tell me in the comments where you're listening from, because what I'm about to share changed how I see the world. And if this resonates, like and subscribe because you'll want to hear how this ends, because there I was, getting fired for something that made no sense at all, from 3 clients. A tech startup that grew from 5 employees to over 200, a family-owned manufacturer that trusted me with their biggest expansion, and a nonprofit that credited me with helping secure their largest grant ever. Clients who'd been happy just weeks earlier, while Jerome stood up and reached for the cardboard box kept for moments like this, told me security would escort me out, and gave me 15 minutes to pack up 3 years of my life, not knowing what no one else in that office knew. That for the past 2 weeks, while I tried to understand why clients had suddenly grown distant, I'd been digging through account files and found something that made my blood run cold. Starting with small things like 6 hours billed for a 2-hour call, service fees I never approved, which I first assumed were clerical errors until I found more. Always small amounts just under the threshold for questions, revealing someone was systematically inflating bills, skimming money so cleverly it looked legitimate, a pattern elegant in its simplicity and disgusting in its execution. Extra hours, mysterious fees, upgraded services never delivered, harmless looking alone but sickening together. Because Jerome was stealing from my clients who trusted me, and as I packed my personal photos and the little succulent Aisha gave me for my work anniversary, with Walter, the kind older security guard, apologizing as he followed me, and whispering that this didn't seem right and that I was always nice, I smiled and said sometimes things don't work out while inside I planned, realizing Jerome had missed one crucial detail in making me the scapegoat. That these clients didn't just trust the company, they trusted me. And I had copies of everything, every email, every call summary, every invoice discrepancy I'd flagged while trying to solve what I thought were innocent billing problems. Files that were now about to serve a very different purpose, as Jerome walked me to the elevator, satisfaction radiating off him while he told Walter to clean this up quickly and remove all traces by the end of the day. And the doors closed, leaving me staring at my reflection in the polished metal. I looked shattered, defeated, exactly the way Jerome wanted me to look. But appearances are often misleading, because that night I sat alone in my apartment with 3 manila folders spread across my kitchen table, each one holding a complete breakdown of every billing irregularity I'd uncovered for each client. Not guesses or accusations, but raw data, dates, amounts, service codes that didn't align with the work actually done. And I wasn't plotting revenge, I was preparing justice. So the first call I made was to Cassandra, the CFO at the tech startup, someone I'd worked closely with for 2 years, and who had always been direct with me about budgets and payment timelines, and she sounded genuinely surprised when she heard my voice, saying she'd heard what happened and that she was sorry, adding that the decision to change account management wasn't personal, and I told her I understood, keeping my voice steady, explaining that the real reason I was calling was to make sure she'd received some information that might matter for her financial records, carefully choosing every word so I wasn't accusing anyone or trying to undermine the company, only sharing documentation that raised questions about billing accuracy that any responsible business would want to review. And when her tone shifted into professional mode and she asked what kind of information, I explained there were discrepancies in recent invoices I'd noticed while reviewing files. Nothing I'd been able to resolve before leaving, but things she should be aware of. And the remarkable thing about Cassandra was that she understood numbers the way I understood people. Because once I walked her through the patterns I'd found, she didn't need help connecting the dots, pausing after the third month of questionable charges to ask if I was saying they'd been paying for consultation hours that never happened, and I replied that there appeared to be inconsistencies between documented services and those billed, and that she'd want to conduct her own review, which led to a long silence before she asked me directly if I was suggesting someone at my company had intentionally overbilled them, and again I chose my words carefully, telling her I was only providing data that showed patterns worth investigating, and that what she did with it was entirely her decision. And after I hung up, I made the same type of call to Marcus at the manufacturing company and Dr. Elizabeth Santos at the nonprofit, using the same calm, factual approach without commentary. And by the time the third call ended, it was nearly midnight, leaving me exhausted but strangely at peace, knowing whatever came next was no longer in my control. And as I went to bed, I thought about Jerome's face when he'd handed me that cardboard box, the certainty in his voice when he'd called it my failure, the ease with which he'd dismissed 3 years of relationship building, unaware that real relationships built on trust don't vanish just because someone gets fired. So when I woke the next morning to 17 missed calls, I wasn't surprised, with the first voicemail from Cassandra sounding tighter than I'd ever heard her, as she said their accounting team had worked through the night, and what they found was significant, and that I needed to call her back immediately, followed by Marcus, with his usual warmth replaced by something sharp, saying they'd uncovered irregularities that needed discussion, and then Dr. Santos, whose message was blunt and direct, saying she'd contacted their legal team and needed to meet that day. But it was the fourth voicemail that finally made me smile. Jerome trying and failing to sound casual as he asked me to call him back because there seemed to be some confusion with former clients, and he thought we should discuss handling it professionally, confusion being his word for it, and I didn't call him back, instead reaching out to each former client to arrange meetings, not as their account manager, but as someone who could provide context for their investigations, starting with Cassandra's team in a conference room at their headquarters, where she'd brought her entire financial leadership group, along with a man I didn't recognize, who introduced himself as a forensic accountant. And together we conducted a full audit of 18 months of invoicing before Cassandra slid a thick folder across the table and said what they'd found went far beyond what I'd flagged. And as I opened it, my stomach dropped because they'd uncovered everything. Not just minor overcharges, but a systematic scheme running for over 2 years involving phantom consulting sessions, inflated hourly rates, and fictional rush charges for standard deliveries, with the forensic accountant explaining the fraudulent billing totaled approximately $87,000 from their account alone, a number that made me think of the other two clients and realize the theft likely reached hundreds of thousands, and Cassandra added that all the irregularities began after a specific date, March 15th, 2 years earlier, a date I knew well because it was exactly 1 week after Jerome's promotion to department manager, and they'd also discovered several charges had been quietly reversed or partially credited, always with notes stating they were approved by account management. Approved by you? My heart froze because I had never approved any of those credits, and she said softly that they knew because they had copies of every document I'd sent them, and my signature had been forged on the approval forms, meaning Jerome hadn't just been stealing from the clients, he'd been carefully setting me up to take the blame if the scheme was ever uncovered, and the meeting with Marcus revealed something even more calculated, because not only had similar overbilling been happening, but Jerome had apparently been. Telling him that I was the one requesting rush charges and premium service fees, positioning himself as the level-headed manager, trying to rein in an overzealous account representative, even calling Marcus 3 weeks earlier to apologize for what he described as my aggressive billing practices, and claiming he was working on controlling me. And by the time I met with Dr. Santos, I finally grasped the full scale of Jerome's plan, how he'd built a system that allowed him to steal money while simultaneously constructing a case against me, with every forged signature, every fraudulent charge, and every fake approval designed to point back to me if anyone asked questions, intending to destroy my career to hide his crimes. But there was one thing Jerome hadn't anticipated, something that would make his carefully built scheme collapse. Because all 3 clients had kept detailed records of every interaction they'd ever had with me, every email, every phone call, every meeting. And those records told a completely different story than the one Jerome had been crafting, showing an account manager who consistently questioned unusual charges, always sought approval for service upgrades, and actively protected their interests instead of exploiting them. And more importantly, they showed that I'd been flagging billing irregularities for months, repeatedly asking Jerome to help resolve what I believed were accounting errors. And as Dr. Santos reviewed my email trail, she said, I'd essentially been trying to stop this, investigating the fraud without even realizing it. And that afternoon, all 3 clients did something unprecedented by jointly requesting a meeting with Jerome and senior leadership, not to talk about renewals or service concerns, but to present evidence of systematic fraud and demand a full external audit. And although I wasn't invited, Cassandra called afterward to tell me what happened, explaining that Jerome had walked into the room expecting damage control, only to find himself facing forensic accountants from 3 firms, legal representatives, and documentation of criminal activity spanning 2 years. And while he tried to claim the billing issues were the result of my poor management and that firing me had been necessary to protect client relationships, that narrative lasted exactly 7 minutes, because the moment evidence of forged signatures and proof that I'd been trying to report the discrepancies was presented, his story completely unraveled. And the most perfect detail was when senior leadership asked Jerome to provide documentation to defend himself, because he couldn't, since every piece of evidence he relied on was fraudulent, making every forged signature, fake approval, and manipulated billing record proof of his guilt rather than mine. And after spending 2 years building the perfect trap, Jerome walked straight into it, being terminated and escorted out within 6 hours by the same security team that had walked me out 2 days earlier, with the company also contacting the district attorney to report potential criminal activity. But the story didn't end there, because that evening I received a call from the company president, Catherine Rodriguez, who apologized for terminating an exemplary employee based on false information and wanted to discuss making it right, offering not just reinstatement, but a new role with expanded authority, a significant salary increase, and direct oversight of a new billing compliance department created in response to the fraud. And most importantly, all 3 clients made it clear they would only continue with the company if I returned, personally managing their accounts with contractual guarantees, because as Catherine told me, they trusted me, and after reviewing everything, she finally understood why. I thought about Jerome, probably sitting in some attorney's office trying to understand how his flawless plan had destroyed his career instead of mine. And I thought about how easily he'd dismissed 3 years of my work, how certain he'd been that he could erase me from the relationships I'd built, forgetting something essential about trust, because real trust, the kind earned through honesty and genuine care, doesn't vanish when someone gets fired. It transfers, it follows the person who earned it, and sometimes that trust becomes the very weapon that takes down the person who tried to exploit it. But that was only half the story, because what happened after I returned to work was even more shocking than the fraud itself. As the investigation Jerome triggered uncovered something that didn't just change our company, but shook the entire industry. And if you want to hear how deep this really went, and what happened when authorities started digging into Jerome's past, tell me in the comments that you're ready for the rest. Because what we uncovered about him, how long this had been happening, and how many people he'd destroyed along the way, will make you question everything you think you know about workplace loyalty. And while you're deciding if you can handle what comes next, hit that like button. If you believe the truth has a way of surfacing exactly when it's meant to, subscribe if you believe people who abuse power eventually engineer their own downfall, because what happened next proved that sometimes the universe delivers justice more perfectly than anything we could plan. And 3 weeks into my new role, I was sitting in my upgraded office when Catherine knocked on my door with a look that made my pulse spike, telling me we needed to talk before closing the door and saying the FBI wanted to meet with me. Those 3 letters making everything real in a way meetings and termination notices never had. Because when financial fraud involves multiple businesses and hundreds of thousands of dollars, federal investigators pay attention. Yet what they uncovered about Jerome went far beyond anything we imagined. And Agent Patricia Henley, a woman in her 40s with sharp eyes and a presence that made you want to tell her everything, sat across from me in a conference room with a file nearly 2 inches thick and said they'd been investigating Jerome Whitman for the past 18 months. My breath catching as I realized they'd been watching him long before our clients found the fraud. And when she told me I wasn't his first victim and showed me photos of 4 former employees, 2 women and 2 men around my age, all wearing the same hollow expression I'd probably had when I was fired, I recognized that defeated confusion instantly as she explained they'd all been terminated under similar circumstances and blamed for client losses caused by systematic fraud. And Jerome had been running this same scheme for over 6 years across 4 companies, getting promoted into management, targeting the most dedicated account managers, using their relationships to fuel fraudulent billing, and when the theft became too visible, destroying their reputations and moving on, the room spinning as I asked how many people, learning there were 7 known victims and that I was number 8, except I was the first who fought back. And Agent Henley explained his pattern was nearly identical every time, selecting employees with strong client trust, forging signatures, creating false documentation, and shaping conversations that painted them as greedy or incompetent, always ensuring they looked guilty. But what turned my stomach was learning that termination was only the beginning, because Jerome would then contact industry connections and spread stories of misconduct, ruining professional reputations so completely that most of his victims left the field entirely. And as I looked at the photo of Isabella Martinez, a woman with kind eyes and a warm smile, Agent Henley told me she'd been a rising star in marketing consulting until Jerome framed her for inflating campaign budgets. She was working at a grocery store now because no one in her industry would hire her. And then there was David Chen, a brilliant financial analyst whose career ended when Jerome made it appear he'd been skimming client accounts, forcing him to move to another state and change careers entirely, becoming a high school math teacher. And I said slowly that what happened to me was supposed to be the beginning, not the end, to which Agent Henley replied exactly, explaining that Jerome's mistake was choosing someone whose clients were willing to investigate instead of quietly walking away, then showing me recordings from his previous companies, hidden camera footage of him forging signatures, phone recordings of him lying to clients about employee behavior, and email trails revealing how methodically he'd destroyed careers to cover his tracks, a pattern so consistent they'd actually predicted his next move, knowing he'd try to pin the blame on his most trusted employee once the scheme became too obvious. And when I asked if they knew this would happen to me, she said they suspected it but needed evidence and needed him to make a mistake, which my client's investigation provided. Yet the investigation uncovered something even more disturbing. Because Jerome hadn't only been stealing money and ruining careers, he'd also been selling client information to competitors, using his access to confidential business data to run a side operation that earned him over $500,000 across 6 years. And every employee he destroyed was also a potential witness to those crimes, so by destroying their credibility, he ensured no one would believe them if they ever spoke up. But Jerome made one critical error. He got greedy, keeping the fraud small in previous companies to avoid major investigations. But my clients were larger accounts, and the amounts he stole kept increasing. And he'd started getting careless, with Agent Henley showing evidence that he'd used company credit cards for personal expenses, charging luxury hotel stays and expensive dinners to client accounts, and even buying a boat he somehow categorized as client entertainment, planning to leave the company within 6 months to repeat the cycle elsewhere, with me meant to be his final scapegoat, taking the blame while he moved on. The cruelty of his plan almost unbelievable as she explained he'd been setting me up for over a year, documenting fake performance issues, creating false client complaints, and even planting evidence in my files to support future accusations, outlining a full exit strategy to blame me for the fraud, get hired elsewhere as the manager who handled a difficult situation, and start again. But what broke my heart most was learning about the other victims. Not just the employees he destroyed, but the small businesses whose trust he exploited, the nonprofits whose limited resources he drained, and the family companies whose growth he crippled, including one nonprofit that shut down entirely, and a family business that laid off 12 employees because they couldn't afford payroll after discovering the extent of his billing manipulation, leading Agent Henley to say Jerome Whitman wasn't just a white-collar criminal, but someone who systematically destroyed lives and livelihoods for personal gain. And the legal process moved faster than I expected, with 7 victims willing to testify and 6 years of documentation leaving his defense little room to maneuver, especially since he'd kept meticulous records of everything, apparently planning to write a book about his corporate consulting experiences, records that became the prosecution's strongest evidence. And during the 3-week trial where I testified for 2 full days, sitting on the witness stand and looking at Jerome in his expensive suit, I felt an unexpected sense of pity, realizing that someone who spends their life destroying others is likely destroying their own soul, because he looked hollow and empty, like someone who'd forgotten how to be human. But that pity vanished when Isabella Martinez testified about how his lies cost her not just her career, but her marriage, her husband believing the accusations, and their relationship collapsing under suspicion and financial stress, followed by David Chen describing the depression that consumed him, spending 2 years believing he was a failure and doubting his own integrity because Jerome's documentation was so convincing, and then Rebecca Torres explaining how his scheme cost her custody of her daughter when she couldn't find work and fell behind on child support, her ex-husband using her alleged misconduct as proof she was unfit to parent, making it clear that Jerome hadn't just destroyed careers, he'd destroyed families. On the day of sentencing, I sat in the courtroom as the judge delivered the verdict: 15 years in federal prison, plus restitution to every victim and affected business. And his words still echo in my mind as he told Mr. Whitman that he had systematically betrayed the trust of employees, clients, and employers for personal financial gain, destroying careers, damaging businesses, and causing immeasurable suffering, calling his actions especially egregious because they were planned, deliberate, and repeated despite countless chances to stop. And while 15 years felt like justice, it also felt too small compared to the lives he'd shattered. Yet the most beautiful part came after the trial, when the 7 of us who testified stayed connected throughout the process, supporting one another and forming an unexpected family, bound by shared pain and understanding. Watching Isabella start her own consulting firm with the very skills Jerome tried to erase, seeing David realize teaching fulfilled him more than finance ever had, and earn a promotion to department head, and celebrating as Rebecca not only regained custody of her daughter, but launched a nonprofit to help other parents survive similar battles. Healing not alone but together, while my own company implemented new oversight systems that became an industry model, and Catherine asked me to lead a task force on fraud prevention, whose recommendations were adopted across our profession. Yet the change that mattered most was personal, because my 3 major clients didn't just renew their contracts, they referred others and specifically asked that I handle their accounts, word spreading in a way that strengthened rather than harmed my reputation, making people want to work with someone who chose integrity over safety. tripling my client base within 6 months and leading to my promotion as regional director with my own team. And sometimes I think back to the day Jerome handed me that cardboard box, so sure he'd won, convinced power mattered more than truth, forgetting that the relationships I built weren't just business arrangements, but human connections rooted in respect and honesty that don't disappear when attacked, but transform into something stronger. And his greatest mistake wasn't the fraud itself, but believing trust was a weakness he could weaponize, when in reality, it became the foundation of his downfall. Because today, I lead a department of 15 account managers who know our job is to protect relationships, not just manage them, fostering a culture where transparency is rewarded and questions are encouraged, and every new hire hears the same message from me: that client trust is sacred, and anyone who tries to exploit it, no matter their position, is our enemy, and we will stand together against them. And Jerome is about 8 years into his sentence now, someone I rarely think about. But when I do, I hope he's learned the true cost of betrayal, not just legally, but spiritually, because the seven of us still meet every year on the anniversary of his sentencing for what we call Phoenix Day, sharing updates about our lives and reminding each other that surviving cruelty doesn't make us bitter. It makes us stronger. And if you've made it this far in my story, know this: if someone is trying to destroy your reputation, your career, or your relationships, don't give up, because truth has a way of rising when people are willing to look beyond lies. So trust your instincts, document everything, and remember that real relationships built on honesty are stronger than any scheme meant to destroy them. And if this story gave you hope or courage, hit like, subscribe for more stories about standing up to workplace bullies and protecting your worth. Share your own experience in the comments. And remember that the most powerful revenge isn't planned or executed. It happens when you refuse to compromise your integrity, because your truth matters. Your trust is sacred, and your future is brighter than anyone who tried to break you could ever imagine.